My daughter cried as she hugged me goodbye at the nursing home. She promised she would visit every week and take care of everything while I recovered. 3 weeks later, she was selling my cars, emptying my bank accounts, and telling everyone I was too confused to understand what was happening. What she didn't know was that one conversation in the dining hall was about to expose her lies and cost her every dollar she thought she had stolen. My name is Michael Thompson. I'm 72 years old, and until 2 years ago, I believed my daughter Emily was the kindest person in the world. After my wife passed away, Emily became my entire support system. She called every day, helped with groceries, drove me to doctor appointments, and constantly reminded me that family was all that mattered. Looking back now, I realized she wasn't helping me because she loved me. She was preparing me. My late wife and I spent more than 40 years building a comfortable life together. We owned a beautiful lakefront house worth nearly $3 million. I had several commercial properties generating rental income every month. There were investment accounts, retirement funds, and a collection of classic cars that I had spent decades restoring. I never considered myself rich, but I had more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. Everything changed after my wife's funeral. The house suddenly felt empty. Every room reminded me of someone who wasn't there anymore. I stopped eating properly. I barely slept. Most days I sat in silence staring at old photographs. Emily seemed genuinely concerned. She visited constantly and kept telling me she was worried about me living alone. At the time, I thought her concern came from love. I couldn't have been more wrong. 6 months later, I slipped on my front porch during a winter storm and fractured my hip. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but recovery would take time. Emily immediately stepped in and took control of everything. She drove me to appointments, handled paperwork, and spoke to doctors on my behalf. Everyone praised her dedication. Nurses called her a wonderful daughter. Even I felt grateful. Meanwhile, she was quietly setting her plan into motion. One evening, Emily sat beside my hospital bed and introduced an idea she had clearly rehearsed. She explained that living alone wasn't safe anymore. She said she had found a private nursing facility with excellent care, beautiful rooms, and medical staff available around the clock. Most importantly, she insisted it would only be temporary. "Just until you're fully recovered," she promised. Those words would haunt me later. The facility itself looked impressive. It felt more like a luxury hotel than a nursing home. The staff seemed friendly, the rooms were clean, and the dining hall overlooked a small garden. Emily helped me settle in and repeatedly assured me she would visit every weekend. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly and cried. Several employees watched the emotional goodbye and commented on how lucky I was to have such a devoted daughter. The first week passed normally. Emily called several times and even visited once. The second week felt different. Her calls became shorter. She always seemed busy. By the third week, I started noticing strange things. My bank sent alerts about transactions I didn't recognize. When I called Emily, she explained everything away. According to her, she was simply managing expenses while I focused on recovery. I wanted to believe her. Then one of my neighbors called unexpectedly. He sounded confused. He asked why my vintage Mustang was being loaded onto a transport truck. I told him there had to be some mistake. That car wasn't for sale. It had belonged to my wife and me for nearly 30 years. When I confronted Emily, she claimed she sold it to cover medical expenses. The explanation didn't make sense, but I had no way to verify it. Over the following month, more things disappeared. Another vehicle was sold. Money left my accounts in unusually large amounts. Personal belongings vanished from storage. Every question received the same response. Emily insisted I was confused, stressed, and struggling to remember details correctly. The more I challenged her, the more she suggested my memory was deteriorating. Slowly, I started wondering if something was actually wrong with me. One afternoon, I overheard 2 nurses discussing my condition. They seemed surprised by how sharp I was. According to paperwork provided by my daughter, I was supposedly experiencing significant cognitive decline. The nurses didn't realize I could hear them. Their conversation lasted less than a minute, but it planted a dangerous question in my mind. Why was Emily telling people I couldn't think clearly when I felt perfectly fine? That question refused to leave me alone. The next day, I requested copies of my medical records from the facility. The administrator seemed hesitant, but eventually agreed. When I reviewed the documents, I discovered several notes describing memory issues that no doctor had ever discussed with me. Even stranger, some observations appeared based entirely on information provided by family members. Specifically, information provided by Emily. For the first time, genuine fear replaced confusion. If my daughter was convincing people I wasn't mentally competent, she could gain tremendous control over my finances and property. I wanted answers, but I needed evidence first. Acting too soon could allow her to cover her tracks. So I remained quiet and started paying closer attention to everything happening around me. What I learned over the next few weeks was far worse than I expected. Every morning, I started spending time in the dining hall instead of staying in my room. Most residents enjoyed talking, and many had fascinating backgrounds. One afternoon, I met a man named Robert Jenkins. He was in his late 70s, sharp as a razor, and surprisingly knowledgeable about the legal system. During lunch, he casually asked why someone like me was living in a nursing home. I gave him the short version. His reaction immediately caught my attention. Robert listened carefully as I explained my situation. When I mentioned the claims about memory problems, his expression changed. He asked several questions that no one else had asked. What doctors made the diagnosis? When were the evaluations performed? Had I ever been formally declared incompetent? My answers seemed to concern him. Finally, he introduced himself properly. Before retiring, Robert had spent 30 years serving as a state judge. The following day, Robert reviewed copies of my paperwork. He spent nearly an hour reading every page. When he finished, he looked directly at me and said something I will never forget. Michael, if what you're telling me is accurate, your daughter may be building a legal case to take permanent control of your estate. Hearing those words felt like being punched in the chest. Everything suddenly started making sense. Robert encouraged me to remain calm and avoid confronting Emily. According to him, people committing fraud often make mistakes when they believe they've already won. Instead, he suggested gathering information quietly. He also gave me the phone number of an attorney he trusted. Her name was Rebecca Lawson, and she specialized in elder financial abuse cases. Robert believed she was exactly the person I needed. Rebecca agreed to meet me 2 days later. Unlike everyone else, she didn't treat me like a confused old man. She listened carefully, reviewed my documents, and asked detailed questions about my finances. The more information I provided, the more serious she became. By the end of the meeting, she had filled an entire notebook with observations. Then she said the words I desperately needed to hear. I think you're telling the truth. Rebecca immediately began investigating. The first thing she requested was a complete transaction history from my bank accounts. What we discovered was alarming. Over the previous 6 weeks, more than $200,000 had been transferred into accounts I didn't recognize. Several withdrawals occurred on days when I was physically unable to leave the facility. Somebody had clearly been moving my money without permission. The deeper we looked, the worse it became. My Mustang wasn't the only vehicle that had been sold. 3 classic cars had disappeared. One of my commercial properties had been listed for sale. There were even documents suggesting Emily had attempted to access certain investment accounts. Rebecca believed we were only seeing the beginning. Whoever was behind this operation had been extremely busy while I recovered. A week later, Rebecca uncovered something even more disturbing. Emily had filed paperwork seeking authority over certain financial decisions due to my alleged cognitive decline. The application included statements describing me as forgetful, confused, and unable to manage my affairs. Several claims were completely fabricated. Some events described in the filing had never happened, yet the documents carried enough weight to cause serious damage. Rebecca arranged for an independent neurological evaluation. Unlike previous assessments, this examination was conducted by a specialist with no connection to Emily. The testing lasted several hours. I answered memory questions, completed reasoning exercises, and discussed current events. At the end, the doctor smiled and shook my hand. According to his report, my cognitive abilities were perfectly normal for someone my age. That report became our first major weapon. Suddenly, Emily's narrative started falling apart. If I wasn't mentally impaired, why was she telling everyone that I was? Why were financial decisions being made without my knowledge? Why were assets disappearing? The questions were beginning to attract attention. For the first time, I felt like the truth might actually come out. Then Rebecca discovered where some of the money had gone. Large transfers had been used to make down payments on a luxury home located less than 20 miles from my lakefront property. The buyer listed on the paperwork wasn't Emily directly. Instead, it was a company she had created only months earlier. The timing wasn't suspicious. It was devastating. While reviewing property records, we uncovered another surprise. Emily had quietly moved into the new house and was posting photos online. Expensive furniture, renovations, luxury appliances, and designer decorations appeared almost overnight. Friends congratulated her on her success. Nobody knew those purchases were potentially funded with money taken from her own father. Rebecca immediately expanded the investigation. The next breakthrough came from one of Emily's former co-workers. After hearing rumors about the case, she contacted Rebecca privately. According to her, Emily had been bragging for months about a future inheritance. She repeatedly joked that she wouldn't need to work much longer because she would soon control everything her father owned. The timing of those conversations raised even more red flags. As evidence accumulated, Rebecca filed emergency motions to freeze additional asset transfers. The court approved several requests. Banks received notifications. Property transactions were flagged. Suddenly, Emily's access to money became much more limited. She noticed immediately. Within 48 hours, she showed up at the nursing facility unannounced for the first time in over a month. And she wasn't happy. Emily stormed into my room demanding explanations. She accused me of being manipulated by strangers and claimed Rebecca was trying to destroy our family. For nearly 20 minutes, she alternated between anger and tears. Then she made a mistake. She admitted knowing details about the frozen accounts that she shouldn't have known unless she was directly involved. Rebecca later called it one of the most valuable conversations in the entire case. After Emily left, I felt emotionally exhausted. Despite everything, she was still my daughter. Part of me wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding, but the evidence continued growing. Financial records, property transactions, witness statements, and medical documents all pointed in the same direction. The person trying to take my life apart wasn't a stranger. It was someone I had trusted completely. 2 weeks later, investigators uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. Hidden within hundreds of pages of records was a document authorizing the sale of one of my commercial properties. The signature looked like mine at first glance, but according to forensic specialists, it wasn't genuine. Someone had forged my name, and the person who submitted the paperwork was Emily herself. When Rebecca showed me the forensic report, I already knew what it would say. The signature on the property sale authorization wasn't mine. Experts identified multiple inconsistencies in the handwriting, pressure patterns, and letter formation. The conclusion was clear. Someone had forged my signature. For a few moments, I simply stared at the page. My daughter hadn't just betrayed me. She had committed a crime. Rebecca immediately forwarded the findings to investigators. What had started as a financial dispute was rapidly becoming a criminal matter. The forged signature gave authorities something concrete to pursue. Unlike family arguments or inheritance disagreements, forgery could be proven. And once investigators started examining every document Emily had submitted, they began finding additional irregularities. Meanwhile, Emily acted as though nothing was wrong. Social media photos continued appearing almost daily. Expensive dinners, luxury shopping trips, weekend getaways. Friends praised her success and admired her new lifestyle. Looking at those pictures made me sick. Much of it had been funded with assets my wife and I spent decades building together. Emily wasn't just stealing from me. She was spending the life her mother and I created. Several weeks later, investigators interviewed employees at the title company involved in the property sale. One worker remembered Emily clearly. She had personally delivered paperwork and appeared unusually eager to complete the transaction quickly. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Now, with the forgery evidence in hand, those details suddenly became extremely important. Then another witness came forward. A banker who handled some of my accounts reported feeling uncomfortable about several transactions months earlier. According to him, Emily repeatedly pressured staff to move money faster and often spoke on my behalf despite lacking proper authorization. Internal notes documented those concerns. Nobody realized how significant they would become until much later. The investigation expanded rapidly. Account records, property files, emails, phone logs, and financial statements were all reviewed. Every new discovery seemed to support the same conclusion. Emily hadn't acted impulsively. This was planned. She had spent months building a narrative that I was mentally declining while quietly positioning herself to take control of everything I owned. One afternoon, Rebecca brought me a stack of documents nearly 6 inches thick. "This is what we've collected so far," she said. Looking through the evidence was overwhelming. There were forged signatures, suspicious transfers, misleading medical statements, and witness accounts. The pile represented months of deception. It also represented something else. Emily's entire future was hanging by a thread. Despite everything, I struggled emotionally. Every night, I thought about the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders during family vacations. I remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle and helping her with school projects. The contrast between those memories and the woman described in the investigation felt impossible to reconcile. How had we ended up here? The answer arrived through a former friend of Emily's. She agreed to speak with investigators after learning about the allegations. According to her, Emily had become obsessed with inheritance years earlier. She constantly complained about waiting for money she believed would eventually belong to her. Over time, that frustration evolved into entitlement. Then entitlement turned into something much darker. Court hearings began shortly afterward. Emily's attorneys argued that every decision had been made in my best interest. They claimed she was simply helping an aging parent manage complicated finances. Rebecca responded with evidence, transaction histories, medical reports, witness testimony. For every excuse they offered, we seemed to have 3 documents contradicting it. The judge quickly noticed the inconsistencies. Several explanations provided by Emily's legal team directly conflicted with banking records. Other statements contradicted medical evaluations. During one hearing, the judge openly questioned why someone supposedly suffering severe cognitive decline had recently passed an independent neurological examination with excellent results. The courtroom became very quiet. After months of delays, the case finally moved toward trial. By then, local media had started reporting on the story. Public interest exploded. Headlines described an elderly widower allegedly defrauded by his own daughter. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years began calling. Some offered support. Others simply couldn't believe what they were reading. The trial itself lasted several weeks. Witness after witness took the stand. Bank employees testified, medical experts testified, forensic analysts testified. Each person contributed another piece of the puzzle. By the end of the second week, the picture was becoming impossible to ignore. Emily had built an elaborate system designed to separate me from my own assets. Then came the testimony that changed everything. Investigators revealed emails discussing future property sales before Emily had legal authority to make such decisions. In several messages, she referred to assets as if they already belonged to her. Some emails were written months before she moved me into the nursing facility. The planning had started much earlier than anyone realized. When Emily finally took the stand, she appeared confident at first. That confidence didn't last. Under questioning, she struggled to explain conflicting documents and contradictory statements. Several times she claimed not to remember details that were clearly documented elsewhere. The more she spoke, the more credibility she lost. Even members of the jury seemed skeptical. The prosecution then introduced evidence regarding the forged signature. Experts explained exactly how they identified the forgery and why the signature couldn't have been genuine. Their testimony was precise, technical, and devastating. For the first time, Emily looked genuinely frightened. She understood what everyone else in the room already knew. The evidence was overwhelming. Closing arguments focused on trust. Rebecca reminded the court that elderly people often rely on family members during vulnerable periods. That trust creates responsibility, not opportunity. She argued that Emily had exploited that trust for personal gain. Looking around the courtroom, I could tell her message resonated with almost everyone present. The verdict arrived 3 days later. Emily was found responsible for financial misconduct, fraud-related violations, and multiple unauthorized transactions. Civil judgments stripped her of control over every disputed asset. Additional criminal proceedings would continue separately. When the judge finished reading the decision, I felt relief more than satisfaction. Property sales were reversed wherever possible. Frozen assets were returned. Accounts were restored. Vehicles that could be recovered came back into my possession. The process took months, but gradually my life started returning to normal. Not everything could be repaired. Some losses were permanent, but the damage wasn't nearly as catastrophic as Emily intended. The luxury house Emily purchased became one of the most visible symbols of her downfall. Because investigators linked its funding to unauthorized transfers, the property became subject to court orders. Eventually, it was sold. Watching news coverage of the sale felt surreal. Just a year earlier, she had believed she was building a dream life. As legal proceedings continued, more information surfaced. Several people who initially supported Emily began distancing themselves. Friends who once admired her success learned where the money came from. Public sympathy disappeared quickly. It turned out that people are far less impressed by wealth when they discover it was stolen from an elderly parent. I eventually left the nursing facility and returned to my lakefront home. Walking through the front door felt emotional. For a long time, I wasn't sure I would ever live there again. Every room carried memories of my wife. For the first time since her death, those memories brought comfort instead of pain. Before leaving, I thanked Robert, the retired judge who first recognized something was wrong. Without that conversation in the dining hall, Emily's plan might have succeeded completely. One simple lunch conversation had changed the course of my life. It reminded me how powerful a single person can be when they're willing to speak up. A year later, I established a foundation supporting victims of elder financial abuse. During the investigation, I learned how common these cases actually are. Many victims never recover their assets. Others are too embarrassed to report what happened. If my experience could help even a few people avoid similar situations, then some good would come from everything that happened. Looking back, the most painful part wasn't losing money or property. It was realizing that the person I trusted most had been planning my downfall while pretending to protect me. Emily thought a nursing home, a few forged documents, and a carefully crafted lie would give her everything I owned. What she didn't understand was that the truth has a way of surviving, and in the end, one conversation exposed everything she stole.